tips and tricks and some cool new features, and just general discussions about our technology. I'm your host, Edward Thongpaneth, and as always, I have a very independable and capable Mary Alice joining me as my co-host for this series. I want to say welcome back. It's been quite a bit of time since our last episode where we focused in on our topics such as OPC UA integration within InTouch. This time around, I think we're going to focus on another feature which is popular in our user community called UDTs, or user defined types. And today's going to be interesting as we have a special guest on our show today. Brian, why don't you introduce yourself before we jump into the content here?
Yeah, well, thanks, Edward and Mary Alice for inviting me to the podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Brian Martin. I'm a technical sales consultant with Aviva. I've been around with the Aviva family for quite a while. I started way back with the Wonderware in the early days of InTouch. So this being an InTouch podcast is very near and dear to my heart. So I do know quite a bit of history about InTouch and how it's been applied over the years. So this is really exciting for all of the new features and the new functionality that I'm seeing getting infused into InTouch. I can't wait to find out more.
Great. Well, I think we have a lot of materials to cover and not a lot of time, right? The whole entire show is designated to be around 15 minutes in length. So before we get into some of the technical pieces in our software and our applications, let's really get an understanding of what we're talking about today, which is UDTs. Brian, Mary Alice, possible to walk the audience through some of your thoughts about this technology or this capability?
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely do that if I can go ahead and get started here. Back in the early days of InTouch, the concept of a user defined didn't really exist. Everything was kind of tag based and there was tags in the system. It didn't exist in any kind of control system either. So never mind being in the SCADA applications. So that functionality was left to the much larger, really expensive DCS type systems that were large rollouts and really, really complicated systems. But as the PLCs evolved, they got more memory, they got faster processors. The manufacturers started to add this functionality into the controllers. So you could take a piece of equipment like a valve or a pump and treat it as a logical piece of equipment. So they could define what's called like a user definable type that mimicked those pieces of equipment in the control system. It could be anything from the valve to the pump to the entire control line.
Yeah, and just to add to what Brian's saying, we first introduced UDTs in the 2023 R2 release of InTouch, and they allow us to define a structured hierarchy for the tags in your InTouch application. So traditionally, when you think about tags in InTouch, you probably think about the tag dictionary where you create your tags to represent the data that you're sending into InTouch from your plant. And when you create these tags in the tag dictionary, there's not really a structure or hierarchy to that data. It's kind of what we've always called flat. Whereas with UDTs, on the other hand, and I think the best way to think about UDTs is as an object-oriented model for your industrial application. So what I mean by that is we can create a data type, add members to that data type, which goes to what Brian is saying, more around mimicking a piece of equipment. And that just allows us to have more structure and more of a hierarchy for the tags.
Yeah, I like the way you describe that hierarchy for the tags, and that object-oriented model is important too, kind of the classes that get created as templates and then the instances, which hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about. So that really helps people kind of standardize the different pieces of equipment in their plant and even standardize the pieces of equipment that are across the different plants or locations that they might have.
Yeah, I appreciate the overview, and I think I get a good understanding about sort of the whole entire process itself. But I'm a type of visual person, and maybe many others are going to be like that as well. So I kind of want to see things live before we get into these concepts. I know that we have some cool things to show to everybody on the call today, but maybe Mary Alice, do you want to share your screen so we can take a look at some of the things that you've developed to really talk about those key concepts there?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I get going, I want to remind everyone that we have a blog post on this topic as well, which dives into some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. And you can actually test some of the things that I'm going to be showing you as well. So Omar is going to be linking to that blog post, so you can follow that link and take a look at that. So the first thing that I wanted to show is how we can actually create UDTs within the InTouch application. So I have this plant that I'm creating, and as part of my plant, I have a couple reactors, and my reactors have mixers, pumps, as well as some other components. So right now what you can see is I have my mixer and my pump UDTs already defined, and you can see the members for each of these UDTs as well. As part of my reactors, I also have a couple of different pump types. So I have a discharge pump as well as an additives pump. So instead of creating two separate data types, one for my discharge pump and another one for my additives pump, where I'm essentially collecting the same types of things like the flow rate, the set point, the start and the stop command, I can actually utilize this pump UDT that I've already defined for my different pump types. So I've already done this for my discharge pump. So let's do this for my additives pump. So I'm going to come in here and create a new data type called additives. And then I'm going to add a new member called pump. And the type for this pump member is going to reference that pump UDT that I've already created. And you can see when I do that, it inherits those members that I've already defined for my pump UDT. And so now what I can do is come into my reactor here and now add a new member to my reactor called additives. And this type is going to reference my additives data type. And same thing, when I do that, it's going to inherit the properties, the members of my additives pump that I just created.
Sorry, you've been kind of going pretty quickly over screen there, Mary Alice. I mean, I really didn't catch some of the conversations around that. I mean, maybe
So Edward, I think Mary Alice did a great job of showing that. You know, this is where that a really good example of that nesting and how she created basically that class for the type pump, and then use that for both the additives and the discharge. So I think that was a really good example of how you could just continue to use that pump. And it really doesn't matter, you know, in some cases that additives pump could be going to, you know, one brand PLC, and the discharge pump could be going to another brand PLC, and it really doesn't matter to this application. And you can look at those pieces of equipment as though they're exactly the same type of piece of equipment.
Yeah, and I think it also shows how you can optimize the creation of your UDTs to help improve the engineering efforts as well. So what you just saw that I did is I was able to have this general pump data type, define the members for kind of this general pump that I have. I did that one time, and I can reuse that pump UDT to represent the different types of pumps that I have within my reactors.
Okay, and this is all great. I mean, you mentioned about optimizing the creation UDTs, Mary Alice. Can you also talk about how you optimize the configuration process? How do you allow it to talk to external devices like OPC UA to communicate to these UDTs that you've created there?
Hey, yeah, let me just jump in there for a second. Mary Alice, I saw the last podcast that you guys did where you talked about the OPC UA tag creator, and that's a really cool new feature in InTouch. If you haven't seen that podcast, go check that one out as well. So I think now with the UDT structure, you can show us something that we could do with OPC or OPC UA with this just as well, right?
Exactly. So when I created these UDTs, I wanted to be able to set them up in a way where they can basically automatically communicate with my OPC UA server based on the structure, based on the item reference. So maybe let's take a look at this here. I have this unified automation UA expert tool where I can browse my OPC UA server. And this just kind of gives a good visual into how my tags are structured within my OPC UA server. So for example, I have my reactor 1, and over here I can see the structure. It's a dot delimited structure. So I have reactor 1 dot additives dot pump dot flow rate. Same thing for my reactor 2. I have reactor 2 dot additives dot pump dot set point. And so if I come back into my InTouch application here, when I create these UDTs, the structure is dot delimited by default. So I can actually, if I set this up properly, I can check to use the item name as the reference name, and that item name will automatically be created to align with my OPC UA item reference. So for example, when I created my pump UDT here, I selected to use the name as the item name, and you can see that dot delimited structure that automatically gets created based on the hierarchy of my UDT. So I have additives, dot pump, dot flow rate. So if I come into my reactor here, I'm going to create a new reactor instance for my reactor 2. And we can see down here, my reactor 2, I have reactor 2 dot additives dot pump dot set point. So that same structure that we just saw within that UA expert tool. And that way, this just kind of helps with improving that efficiency when you set up your communication with your OPC UA server.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That goes right back to those logical structures that they've been using in those user-defined types, right, in the PLC. So it gives you, or it gives us the ability with the InTouch software to just match that structure and have things match right up. If you built the structure, correctly, that's really pretty cool. One of the advantages to that is, in the last podcast, I think it's really cool to be able to just grab a whole bunch of OPC UA tags and drag them down and have them items and drag them down and have them create those tags is really cool. But you're kind of browsing for that and picking and choosing what you need. And you do still have to browse to it. And you can browse and select the individual items. But this is really cool because it just matches the whole thing up with that structure. Because browsing works great if I got 1, 2, or even 100. But when I start to get into thousands or tens of thousands that I have to browse to, that would really get difficult. This is a really cool solution to just map those things up.
Yeah. And sorry, in the interest of time, I think we're coming close to our end of time. I know, Mary, you have a couple more things to showcase here. One of the things I want to see is how do I use the data that you mapped here with the UDTs to graphics or faceplates that somebody would do inside of InTouch?
Yeah, so the last thing that I kind of wanted to talk about was that UDTs can also support relative referencing with owning objects. So what I mean by that is I can create a graphic and I'm able to reuse that graphic anywhere that I may need within my InTouch project. And I can dynamically switch the content that's being shown on that graphic during runtime based on the relative referencing with the owning objects. So let's maybe take a look at an example of that here. So what I've done is I created this reactor faceplate graphic, and I added this combo box that allows me to select between reactor 1 and reactor 2. And based on which reactor I have selected, it's going to update the owning object of my reactor faceplate here to show the data for either reactor 1 or reactor 2. And in the past, when you did set something up like this, it required scripting. And now I can actually just update this to say, I want to, based on what reactor I have selected, I want that to update the owning object of my reactor faceplate here. So this eliminates that need for scripting. So maybe let's take a look at this in runtime here. So I'm going to run my project, and let's open up that window here. And so right now I have reactor 1 selected. We can see the data coming in for reactor 1. If I switch to reactor 2, it's that same faceplate graphic that I created. It's just now showing my information and data coming in for reactor 2.
Awesome. And Brian, any thoughts on how our customers could potentially introduce this technology or any other best practices before we go?
Yeah, certainly. Mary Alice, that's a great example of showing, the ease of use of using that owning object type functionality. And, InTouch has been around for quite a while. And I could say when I first started using it, we could do just about everything, anything in InTouch, but we had to do a lot of work to do it sometimes. And, Mary Alice mentioned some scripting, and, we could do things like this with big groups of tags and using indirect technology, and it all worked good, but it took a little bit more engineering. What you showed us, you simply just did this in a couple of minutes basically, and you could go in the background and add a new piece of equipment and not even have to change any of the graphics. So that does, like you said, eliminate a lot of scripting, a lot of the use of indirect tags and things like that. It makes these applications really easy to build.
Awesome. Thanks for the final comments and really appreciate it. But unfortunately, we reached the end of our time and really our end of our 15-minute episode today. So if anybody who's interested or wants to be a part of this sort of podcast and show, we'd like to get your ideas on our forum. So if you go out to our Aviva Heroes HQ Tech forum there and just put your ideas out there, we'd love to hear them, love to understand a little bit more what you're coming across, and certainly have a lot more episodes in the near future here. But if you want, you can also reach us at our Aviva website, our LinkedIn or Twitter post. Really contact us. But thank you so much again for coming out, and we'll see you soon in the next episode.
Yeah, thanks everybody. If you don't have InTouch, get in touch. If you don't, keep in touch. Thanks everybody.
Thanks.
All right, bye.